I have a talk, but I'm also kind of improv as I go through. Because, my life as a scientist, I've had kind of, I think, 2 lives or 3 lives as a scientist that all have interwoven with each other in complicated ways. I guess I've spent most of the last 20 years trying to navigate, through the world of science as a scientist, while kind of appreciating that the world of science is messed up in a whole lot of different ways, and trying to both figure out how to change it, but also kind of learn about what it means to try to function as a scientist in a messed up system, and how difficult it is to kind of have a career on the one hand and try to deal with the way science works on the other. I think it's been a kind of an interesting journey. A lot of people have mentioned microarrays today. It's kind of weird because I think nobody's used them. And it actually also, my story with this starts with microarrays, interestingly. So I was a postdoc at Stanford back in the mid-1990s. And I was in lab of Pat Brown, who's been easily the most influential person in actually, I have a picture of Pat. Pat likes to show embarrassing pictures of me in talks, so occasionally have to retaliate. So I joined Pat's lab. For those of you who don't know, Pat's done a lot of things in science, but one of the first big things he did as a independent scientist was invent DNA microarrays, or one of the ways of making DNA microarrays. He basically decided that as we got more and more genome sequence data, that it would be useful in a bunch of different ways to take physical representations of all the genes in a genome and spot them down onto glass. This was all done with robots and PCR products of genes. It's now done in much fancier ways. But I was really lucky that one day, right after I graduated, I finished my PhD, and I really didn't know what I was going to do with my career. I was not particularly thrilled with what I didn't want to stay in the field I'd worked on. My first NSF proposal for a postdoc got rejected. I was going to spend a year collecting snakes in Madagascar and milking them for venom to study snake venom structure evolution, but NSF didn't think that was worth doing, although they now invest many millions of dollars in it, so it's kind of ironic. I had a summer job lined up where I worked as a minor league baseball announcer, and I wasn't even sure I was going to stay in science, to be honest. At some point it was tempting, I was tempted to continue in this career as a minor league baseball announcer, but I'm probably happy I didn't do that. But David Botstein, who subsequently became one of my postdoctoral advisors, showed me a DNA microarray, and I was fascinated by this that the world of this kind of new way of doing science in which you could. I'd spent my entire PhD thesis working on one protein, or really 2 proteins, and then all of a sudden you had this possibility of working on thousands and thousands of things at once. And this DNA microarray took me to California. It took me, from a completely different world of science in New England to science in California. And there's a whole discussion one could have about that. But it also launched my life into in thinking about the mechanics of science and how science works. When I finished my PhD, I would say I had little or no perspective on science as an endeavor. I buried my head in the lab. I did what all PhD students did, which is work really hard. There was nothing. Science communication didn't exist. Like no one talked about it. It was not a concept in any way. At least not in the world I lived in. remember, the internet didn't exist either. And so I got to California. There was this, this sort of microarrays represented the beginning of the genomics revolution, but it also was the moment of the internet was being born as an actual functional societal thing. We'd all had internet connections, but we mostly just used them to share data and play network video games. There was no real communication that happened in any public sense on the internet while I was in graduate school, but by the time I got to being a postdoc, it had all changed. And so these two things converged in an interesting way for my career. So first of all, this DNA microarray is a representation of the yeast genome on a piece of glass. And the thing that ultimately kind of got me involved in thinking about the mechanics of science is the fact that, yeast has a lot of genes, 6,000. At the time that we started to do these experiments, which, mid-1990s, so I counted this in like 1988, there were like 45,000 papers that described different yeast species. And, we just heard a talk about the idea of going back to your data. But in the ideal way that science should work, you should be able to go back not just to your data, but to everybody else's data and to everybody else's thoughts, and right, that's our idea of science, right? So the ideal of science is that we sort of operate as this grand collective where we all generate information, and somehow or another we're going to use other people's knowledge to generate this. We've been publishing these papers. I'm going to sort of riff over my slides. I'm not going to really use them all, but we've been writing all this stuff down for centuries, right? And since the 17th century, I spent most of my graduate school. I wasn't at the bench. I was in the library pulling out papers, and it just happened. It just happened all really coincidentally, I'd say, that at the same moment we were starting to collect data in biology on a much bigger scale, we were changing the way that we were publishing, and almost exactly at the same time we started to do these microarray experiments, scientific journals started to publish online, right? It's actually kind of a shock, but there was a period of time when science journals were pioneering users of the internet. They were amongst the first big organizations to throw their publishing efforts online. They were putting contents of scientific articles into their websites. And we rather naively thought, well, we can achieve this great ideal we have for science, which is that science, you obviously no single person can absorb all the information that's ever been written about even one organism, let alone all organisms into their brain, but a computer can do that. Right? You could store the entirety of the scientific literature on a computer even back in the 90s. It wasn't that much, in terms of data. It's a lot of very useful information, but it wasn't that much stuff. So we figured, well, we're in this new era. We can start putting all this stuff together. And this is when we ran into the reality that science doesn't function the way that it should. That we have all these structures, both structures of our careers, structures of the way we publish, structures of the way that we're rewarded for what we do, that actually in every way interfere with the proper functioning of how science should work. And what I'm talking about in particular here is that even from the very beginning, the way that publishing worked, it thwarted what we wanted to do with the scientific literature. And I think we're all familiar with all these weird pathological ways that the internet has both sort of changed our lives for the better, but also changed our lives for the worse. And one of the weirdest things to me has been our propensity to take the pathologies of pre-internet function and graft them into the internet. And there's probably no greater example of that than the fact that we had this technology that in principle could have made all of the scientific literature freely available to everybody anybody at least had an internet connection. And somehow we didn't seize that opportunity, that instead we took it as an opportunity to make more money for publishers. And that this experience we had with running into the fact that that there was a whole world out there that treated scientific knowledge and scientific data as property rather than as knowledge, and that interfered with science, started for me kind of this parallel life of trying to change the way that that science functions. And I think I've learned some things about how hard that is and why it's hard, and that hopefully can be useful. I'm gonna very quickly go through why I think this is a problem, but I'm not actually going to spend too much time thinking about this as a pitch. Just to say that it should be kind of obvious that the way we need to, it was obvious to us back then, it should still be obvious to people now that the way we publish needs to change. Very few people have access to the literature. Scientific papers look basically the same as they did in the 17th century, which is totally ludicrous. The whole process is insanely slow. It's so slow, I like to use this metaphor, it's so slow that in most fields, it would be more efficient way of publishing your paper to put it onto a rocket that's sending a lander to Mars, to have that lander spit the paper out onto the surface of Mars, take pictures of your paper and beam them back to Earth. That because this is being done by a NASA project, those images would be in the public domain. So those would be accessible to the public more quickly than if you sent them to a scientific journal and went through the normal peer review process. It's just completely insane. It actually takes longer for the typical paper today to be made public than it did before the internet came along, and it's just insane. It's insane. It's really expensive. You could actually fund a mission to Mars to take your paper there for less than. You probably can give me a better price on this, but I don't think it costs $10 billion to send something to Mars. But we spend $10 billion every year on scientific papers. I think the only thing that would make that a worse way to do is I don't think the bandwidth of the connections to Mars are quite good enough to send all the scientific literature back to us. And the whole system works really, really poorly. Peer review as it exists today is terrible. It doesn't find papers that are good. It doesn't find papers that are correct. It's slow, but whatever. I think everybody who works in science knows about this. It also distorts the way we function. We worship at the altar of a few scientific journals. So the thing that I think is more interesting to talk about in this science is why do we have such a dumb system for communicating science when we're all, smart people, we all want to communicate what we do. I've never met a scientist who thinks it's a good idea to take their work and lock it up behind some paywall. Why is it so bad? And what can we do as individuals to change it? And I will say that when I first kind of was made aware of this by circumstance and by other people, I had the reaction most people have, which is, okay, that sucks. Now I'm going to go back to the lab and do my work. And but Pat Brown, who was my my postdoctoral advisor, he always had a different attitude, which was, well, it sucks, yeah, but so that's an opportunity to try to fix things. And I'm constantly amazed at how, even for myself, I'm no moral judgment here. I wasn't inclined to do that until Pat sort of gave me a push in this direction. How infrequently scientists have this take the next step in thinking about the problems we have in science to say, most people look at science as this horrible big structure that we don't know how to fix. It's operated in such a pathologically disorganized way that it's hard to point your finger at any individual or individuals who control anything. Like if I said to you right now, you want to change the way that science works, who would you talk to, right? There's no committee who runs science. None of the, even the NIH is it's not even clear who you talk to at the NIH if you want them to change anything. That science operates, I think, to its benefit in a decentralized way, but it makes it incredibly difficult to change things. We spent, I would say, about 5 years trying to change the way that science publishing worked from within, and it didn't work at all. We couldn't convince anybody, actually we didn't need to convince anybody that the system was broken, but it was impossible to convince anybody to fix it. And that includes scientific societies, the NIH for the most part. I mean, the NIH director was was trying to change things, but even he was thwarted by the kind of nebulous institutions of what's the word? My brain, I'm getting old, I can't remember words, but the deep state, right? There's a deep state in science, right? And the scientific deep state just makes it really, really difficult to change everything we do. So I'm not going to, because I don't have time, I'm not going to tell you the whole story of what we did, but we decided finally that we needed to change this by actually doing things. And so, we had what at the time, wasn't just crazy even to us, but everybody told us that it was crazy, this idea that a bunch of scientists would just start some new way of publishing. But we went out, it's California, it turns out to be really easy to get people to throw millions of dollars at you in California for reasons I don't fully understand, but I'm willing to take advantage of, that we got a large amount of money to start an alternative way of doing publishing. Most of you probably, this is just all verbiage about it. This was about the early efforts to change it. It didn't work. Nobody participated. We started to have an open letter to get everybody to sign on. Every scientist said that they hate the system. We'll do whatever we want to change it. But when push came to shove, when push comes to shove, scientists hate the current system. But if you ask them to do something different, they won't do it because they think that their jobs are in jeopardy, and probably correctly, for just shunning the way the world operates. And this has been the central problem that I think everybody faces in science today, which is, and publishing I think is a good metaphor for this, which is how should we publish? Probably the best way for us to publish is just to have a website where we post all of our results every day when we're doing our experiments, and then other people can think about our data, they can see our data, whatever. Why don't we do it? I mean, why don't you guys do that? Why don't we post our data every day? It's because, first of all, it's a little bit of a pain in the butt, but if people want to do it, certainly you can post cat videos with ease. There's no particular reason why we couldn't be posting our data. We don't do it because the system doesn't reward you for doing so, and in fact, it probably would punish you, right? If you posted all your data on a daily basis, there's thousands and thousands of other people out there who might beat you to the punch in figuring out what's particularly interesting about your experiments, and you would get screwed because that's just the way science works. And the same thing's true with changing the way you publish and all sorts of other things. And I will say we've made a lot of progress in the way that we publish papers. Right now there's lots of open access journals. You can get your work out there quickly. There's a new economic model for publishing. You can post your work on bioRxiv or preprint servers in biology, or you've been doing it for 400 years if you're a physicist. But I'm actually astonished by how little impact we've had on the way that science functions, and to the point that we're no better off. And I consider this to be kind of just a complete failure of our efforts to I think we were able to change the way that science publishing works, but almost every single change we made was co-opted by the system into both its economic models, but also I think we're worse off now than we were 20 years ago in terms of the pressure that people feel to cleave to the structures of science. So when I started my career at Berkeley, I was told in no uncertain terms by people that if I didn't publish in high-profile journals, my career would be ruined. I would never achieve anything. I wouldn't get tenure. I wouldn't get grants. I wouldn't be successful. That's proven to be wrong. I'm not sure, and I just kind of ignored them. I basically said I don't want to be a scientist if those are the rules, and so I didn't listen to them. I managed to succeed, I think, in spite of that, or maybe in some cases because of it. But I'm not sure that's true if I did that today, to be honest. That I think the system's it's gotten worse. The pressure for money in fields has gotten worse. The pressure to conform to certain ways of doing science has gotten more pernicious in the modern era, and I think we're in a bad situation because of this, and I see this because after 20 years of fighting to have for sort of open access publishing and to make sure people can get access to papers, that problem I think is mostly behind us. Partly, I'm going to zoom really far ahead here. So it's mostly behind us because people have hacked the system, right? Like, if you want to get access to scientific papers now, you can get access to pretty much anything through these dodgy Russian websites, Kazakh websites, sorry. And if you prefer to do things legally, right? Like it's basically, we're not there yet, but the push in biology is to have everything posted in preprint servers, and that I think these combinations of two things is basically changed this problem we've been trying to fix for 20 years. But while all that's happening, the basic pressures on behind the scenes in science haven't gotten a lot better, and this has been manifest for me by the kind of over the last year or two by the kind of challenge I think we have to take over next, which is how do we actually assess people in science? So I don't know if all of you feel this way, but what do you think ultimately you're judged by as a scientist? What is the criteria that, if there was the moral equivalent of the gates of heaven, and you had how to get through them as a scientist, and those are probably getting a job at a big university. Like, what ultimately are you judged by? Yeah, like I ask people this question all the time, and literally nobody ever says by my science, right? Like it's a weird thing we've got, right? We have this whole notion that science is this great thing. We produce knowledge. We're contributing to this great collective of knowledge. Your knowledge is useful because it leads to new discoveries, and maybe some of those new discoveries help cure a disease, or they make some new thing that people like, or they increase our understanding of the world. And I would figure you would have a world where people felt that they were judged by what kind of science they produced but literally no one ever says that. I honestly, I don't think anyone has ever answered the question for me, like what you're judged on as a scientist, by saying your science. And that is a super big problem, right? So, we could have a whole other discussion about the role of science in public, right? Public doesn't, lots of people write about and talk about the lack of faith public has in scientists. I kind of think they're right in not having a lot of faith in us in some ways. Scientific, there's a lot of things that are out there that are public policy issues that are influenced by science, and I completely agree, with the quote before that we kind of need more scientists in public office, but we really need just more scientific thinking in public office, and there's a lot of kind of empiricism that's missing from the way we function about things. But it's always a little bit weird to me to see scientists lecturing the public and politicians about a lack of empirical thinking in political decisions, when we have a complete and total lack of empirical thinking in the way that we function as scientists, right? So why is it that we judge, we accept a system where, I would say the journal publishing system is as stupid as most of the really stupid things that happen in politics. It's not pernicious, right? It doesn't lead to people walking around with AR-15s on their back and things like that. But it's just as dumb and just as illogical and just as unempirical as some of the worst political decisions we see politicians make. Again, I don't think it's as destructive, but we accept that we accept kind of really dumb systems for science, and And I think it's pretty easy. I'm not going to go through the exercise with you, but I do it all the time. It's pretty easy if you get a bunch of scientists in the room to map out better ways for science to function. That's at the level of how we assess each other's work, how we assign grants, how we reward people's careers, how we do other things. I have a whole little pitch about, right? Like I think we could function entirely and completely without journals. I'd be happy to talk about this to people. I don't know how much time I've taken, how much time I should probably stop in a second. But let me, it's actually really easy to design better ways for science to function. I think that in a lot of these cases, what I would draw up on the board is probably different than what someone else might draw up on the board. But I think it's pretty clear that if I would be happy taking any scientist, pretty much any scientist in the world, and saying, go into a room and design a better system for science communication. And I guarantee it would be better than what we do right now. And I'd be happy to see us implement almost any of these ideas because we're in such a bad state for how we communicate, how we assess each other's work and things like that, that almost anything would be better. For 20 years I've heard people say, you're going to destroy science publishing, which I think would be awesome. And I think that but I also think we should get rid of the way that people are hired at universities. We should get rid of the way that people are judged in graduate school. All these things are messed up in how we reward grants that you could do better instantly. The challenge is it's really, really hard as a scientist to actually impact those things. So maybe in just the last 2 minutes, I'll just say something that I feel like I've learned from all these years in both successes and failures, which is we need more scientists to focus on fixing science, right? It's a part of this public engagement that is too infrequently discussed, right? There's a lot of pressure and emphasis on getting scientists engaged in public policy, in public communication, all of which is incredibly important and I think what we need to do. But we have relatively few people who say to themselves that we need to fix the way science works. And there are programs to support that, really, right? Like AAAS likes to fund lots of things about science communication, but there are no fixed science fellows, right? We need more people who take it upon themselves to look at the way science functions and to fix it, right? And it's easy to figure out what the big problems are. There's the way we communicate, the way we hire and reward people. We have horrible problems with the way that people are treated in science. We have horrible problems with the mental health of graduate students and faculty and everybody in science. We know all these problems, but have no mechanism to fix them. And very few people who say to themselves, "I'm going to make this my mission in my career to fix science and to." In some cases, put your career at risk, and this is, I was in a very lucky position when I got hired. I've been in the right place at the right time as a postdoc, so my work was very well known. I could afford to take chances, and I might not have gotten all the greatest grants in the world or whatever, but I never felt at risk of losing my job because I was engaged in trying to fix science. That's not true for everybody, but we need people who are gonna take some degree of risk in their careers and or make it the focus of their careers to try to fix science. And so I want to end on that note and just say that it doesn't exist at the moment. We don't have a push within science to examine the way that we function. Astonishingly few scientists ever take a class that talks about how does science function, what's broken with it. People will teach you things like, here's how you get your work published. I've gone to a bunch of seminars where people tell you how to get your work published, and they basically, how to schmooze an editor, how to write a suck-up-y cover letter, right? Nobody ever says, well, this system is really dumb. Let's talk about how we should fix it. The same thing's true with jobs, right? Nobody says, you get seminars for our postdocs where they say, here's how you can, here's all the things you need to do to get a job at a high-profile university. And the advice is just it's dismal, right? It's like pick sexy topics, go to conferences and find the people whose universities you want to hire. No one ever says just do some kick-ass science and you'll be fine, because it's not true. And anyway, I'll stop with that and just say, let's make this happen. Let's figure out a way to turn our efforts inward a little bit in science, to make science function more effectively in lots of different ways. And I think that if we do that, we'll have a more positive impact in the way that science is perceived and the influence that science has in the external world than I think people anticipate. So I will stop with that. I'll take any questions you have about this or anything else, and we'll take it from there.